we love talking draft with better than Shane Malloy from Hockey Prospect Radio. And Shane joins us now just a couple months away from getting everyone together in Montreal. Shane, how are you? Great to have you back on the program.
I'm doing great, Andrew. And look, I can't wait for the draft. We're actually inside of a rink with all the fans and having the teams on the floor and the media up on the risers and just being able to actually enjoy the event, because I did not enjoy it over Zoom the last couple of years. It was not fun. So it's our end of the year event, and that's where everybody gets together, and there's just nobody's really in a little stressful situation. So it's a great opportunity to actually connect and see people and talk to the NHL guys and find out what's really going on.
Yeah, man, I'm sure from your perspective, the only thing worse than doing the draft on Zoom was trying to scout on Zoom and scout on video and not get out to games and not have the games to be played. I mean, certainly we're in a much better place than everything that we've been through in the last couple of years. And, what a great way to get back to a real draft, to do it in Montreal and, of course, have the Habs on the clock as we speak after winning the lottery, after the most miserable season and the first ever 32nd place finish in National Hockey League history.
Well, I think it's going to be great for the Habs fans, and it's going to create a tremendous atmosphere. If you've never been to a game in Montreal, it's a great place to go see a game. The atmosphere around the city and inside the rink, they do it right. So, and talking about right, obviously I expect him to be the first overall pick. So it's gonna add some additional buzz when the team that's hosting is the first overall pick. So, but your guys' focus is all on the Winnipeg Jets. So I'm curious to see what they're going to do. And based on, what I've seen over the last 5 or 6 years, I have an inkling of what direction they'll probably go in. But, as that draft sort of plays out, they're at the mercy of, the 13 teams in front of them.
Well, just before we get to the Jets and that spot in the draft, quickly on the number one pick, is Shane Wright clear-cut number one? Is there much competition for him? I've heard sort of some different things throughout the season.
No, I think from my perspective, he's number one. And primarily because of his two-way play. Look, he has offensive upside. And at worst, I think he's going to be a number two center. But what I really like about him is his mental and emotional toughness. I think this is a kid who's going to be built for NHL playoffs when he hits his peak years. Won't be right away. You got to let him develop like every other kid, because he is a kid. He's 18. So, in that respect, you have to be a little bit patient with him, and I think the Montreal Canadiens will do that. I'm always wary of bringing in 18-year-olds into the NHL. Most of the time, it's some tough sledding unless they're absolutely elite. So we'll see how this young man does next year.
How close is the gap, or how big is the gap between 1 and 2? And after the first selection, is there a number of players that are sort of in the mix for number 2? Or I mean, where's that next tier, if you will, after Shane Wright goes off the board, Shane?
Well, I think there's about 4 players sort of in that second tier. You're sort of looking at Logan Cooley and Juraj Slafkovsky, and as I look through my list, I think Simon Nemec is probably in that list as well. And so that's kind of like those three guys in that sort of range that'll be in there. And then there's another tier and another tier. And I'm still in data collection mode. So my tiers are just sort of like it's a group of names. And because you have to collect as much information as you can. And there's no reason to make lists. I know in the public area, they have to make lists because there's content demand. But I don't bother. I don't do that till the bitter end, until I have no choice but to make a decision, because why force yourself into a decision when you don't have to? So I'm usually, a week before the draft or a little bit after the combine. In a normal year, that's when I'm really piecing it together.
And it's a great point, because I think from NHL teams' perspectives, I mean, they will have the guys that they like, they'll have their values, they'll figure out where you think they would be, and they'll make decisions based on best player available. I mean, the bottom line is you can draft for need, but because of the timeline from when these young men are selected as to when they're National Hockey League players, in most cases, Shane, a lot changes in that period of time.
It could end up being irrelevant. That's the big thing. So this isn't the NFL. It's somewhere between a 4 to 6, maybe sometimes even 7 years till the player is a full-time player and contributing. So, I mean, of course, there's always outliers and guys jump in early at 18 or 19 or 20, but generally it's draft plus 5. That's normal. And I don't start evaluating draft classes until 5 years past, because it takes that long for players to develop into NHL players, in some cases a little bit longer. And it's too difficult to give a fair assessment until that point in time.
Overall, when you look at this draft and without kind of, having a final list, I mean, you've got a good idea about the general talent pool. I mean, how would we categorize this? Is this a deep draft? Is it top heavy? Are the prospects throughout the first round pretty consistent so that a team in the middle of the pack like Winnipeg should have a number of good options when they're on the clock?
I think this draft class, it has good talent, but not a lot of elite talent. And I think it has depth. So it's the number of players I think will play more than 200 games. I think it'll probably hit 60, might even hit 62. And historically, it's 56 is the number of players will play 200 games. So there's a lot of depth in this draft. I found there's a lot of those 2 and 3rd line forwards, kind of like those middle 6 forwards. There's a lot of those in this draft class, especially in the first 50. And in terms of defensemen, there's a lot of 3s and 4s, but not necessarily the 2s or the 1s. So that's where, there is an opportunity for teams to move down if they wish, because I think once you kind of get to that 20 to 40, in many cases, depending on your preference and how you weight attributes and what you value in terms of playing style, you could pretty much put all these names in a bag and then randomly close your eyes and pull one out.
Well, based on what you said, how big of a boost is it for teams like Buffalo and teams like Columbus that'll have multiple first-round picks in the top half of the first round?
It's tremendous. It changes your franchise. If you hit, even if they are second-line forward, say if Columbus hypothetically drafts 2 defensemen and they're both end up being, say, a number 2 and a number 3, that changes your franchise. Or Buffalo takes 2 forwards and they're 2 second-line forwards, changes your franchise. They're not elite, but you also don't have to, if you get those type of players, you don't have to go and acquire them in a trade or in free agency. You don't have to spend additional assets. You don't have to overpay for players, which tends to happen too often in free agency. So that's where the value comes in when you have, 2 picks in the top 15.
Shane, before we kind of get down the board and talk about a few players, I want to ask you about Russian players in this draft. First, was the scouting at all different this year coming out of COVID with being able to, was it improved being able to see these players? And because of what's happening in the world right now with the war in Ukraine, are Russian players, will they be further down in the list? Will we see as many drafted? I mean, what do you make of that entire situation as it pertains to the National Hockey League draft?
Well, Andrew, as you've seen over history, NHL teams tend to be risk averse. So they don't like to take unnecessary risk. I don't think there's any risk in taking a Russian player, because by the time that player is ready to play, it's maybe 5 or 6 years down the road. In all honesty, I have no idea what the geopolitical world is going to look like in 5 or 6 years. Nobody does. So, and for me, I'm not going to punish a 17 or 18-year-old kid based on the decisions made by their government. That's not their fault. But I know there's going to be certain owners and certain teams that are not going to do that. So what that allows organizations to do that are not afraid to take Russians is there's going to be a tremendous amount of value from 25 to 45 or even to 50. I mean, and if you have multiple picks in the 2nd and 3rd rounds, you could come out like a bandit. 5 years from now, you could look out and say the teams that, passed on these Russians shouldn't have done it, because there's a lot of players that are from Russian nationality are very, very talented. So, and I don't think the Winnipeg Jets are afraid to take Russian players. They weren't in the past, and I don't think they are going to be in this draft or in the future.
Well, and the funny thing about the Jets is for a long time, they didn't really take any Russians for the most part. The last couple drafts they've had, and we've been seeing Chiprikov and I believe Bertushny, I might be butchering his name a little bit, the seasons that they've had right now. You'd have to think that, maybe they hit and got incredible value where they picked these players. I mean, every team is going to look at what's happening with the Minnesota Wild right now and look at the patience and how long they waited for Kaprizov, who, if I'm not mistaken, was like a 5th round pick. I mean, you got a player like that in the 5th round. I mean, that, to your point, can be franchise changing.
Certainly. And you could do this with 2nd and 3rd round picks. That's the advantage for them. And I like what the situation Winnipeg is in terms of their player development, because their farm system is in Winnipeg and all their facilities are in Winnipeg. So if you're a prospect, you come into the American Hockey League, you can just get your condo or get your house and you're there and you don't have to move. And then all the staff is there. Like, I can't emphasize in terms of performance management how a tremendous advantage that is for the Winnipeg Jets and how attractive that is to young prospects, because they don't want to be, 3 time zones away and all these flights away from the big club. They want to be able to have that interaction on a regular basis.
Yeah, I know. We've heard that from a number of players. And we're going to actually have Morgan Barron on later on in the program to talk about the big win for the Moose last night and tomorrow's game number 4. And we're also going to be speaking with Matthew Savoie on the program. And, I may as well ask you about the Winnipeg Ice. What a season they've had so far this year. And looking at the North American Central Scouting rankings, you got Savoie and Geekie at 4 and 5 after monster seasons for both them individually and their team right now. Have you seen much of the Ice, and what do you think about those 2 young men I just mentioned and their prospects to be first rounders and where they end up?
Well, a tremendous team. They're going to go on a long run. I would not be surprised if they're in the Memorial Cup. And the Memorial Cup is hosted right down the road from me. So if they do make it there, I'll get to see them again, which is great. And for their prospects in the draft, I'm not surprised if both those players are drafted in the top 15. Wouldn't surprise me at all. I mean, they're both different players in terms stylistically, but each has their own attributes that I think are really attractive to NHL teams. And I know there was some discussion about Morgan, about Geekie's skating, but I'm not concerned about it because with time, he'll be able to be an effective skater at an NHL level. All he has to be is average, because all his other attributes are very good to potentially elite amongst his peer group. And I think he's perfectly capable of being a second-line center in the NHL, and there's no rush on him. So you already have the size component, the hockey sense, the puck skills. So just sort of amp up that skating a little bit, and he'll be fine.
What are the things about Matt Savoie that makes him such a tantalizing prospect to NHL teams?
Stylistically, he sort of reminds me of Mike Comrie when he played for the Edmonton Oilers. He reminds me of him in that respect. Like darting, creative, really good hockey sense, being able to use the give and go, understands how to play pace, how to change his skating speed, and be able to create time and space. So, although he's smaller in stature, I think because he's so elusive, I don't think that's going to be problematic. And you've seen other small centers like Nick Suzuki be highly successful in the NHL. So I don't suspect that Savoie is going to have too many challenges once he finishes his development.
Shay, you've been doing this for a long time. I'm interested just to ask you about how the game has changed in the National Hockey League over the last 10 years. If we were talking, say, a dozen years ago about Matt Savoie, how different would he be thought of as an NHL prospect because of his size than where we are today with the speed and skill that is really dominating the National League?
He'd be drafted in the mid-second round, similar to what happened with Alex DeBrincat. That's exactly what I suspect would happen. And I think teams have had to accept the fact that there's multiple ways to win. There's multiple ways for players to be successful. So I think when it ends up happening with organizations, it's no different than any other industry. You get burned enough times or you see enough historical data, hopefully you'll learn your lesson and you do your due diligence, and you have to recognize your own personal biases. And I've had to learn that through. This is our 17th year on a show. I've been trying to learn how to evaluate players since, primarily 2000 to 2003 when I first started. It's not easy. I mean, it's the hardest job in hockey. And I have a double walk-in closet full of skeletons of the mistakes I've made in evaluating. So I'm no different than any other, NHL scout that's out there. You just try to learn and really control your biases. That's really one of the big things, and make sure that you have an organized process when you are evaluating players and then beginning to rank them.
Back to this year's class, when we're speaking about those prospects, and you mentioned there's a very few truly elite prospects and then a bigger group of players that could be very good players in the league. When we're talking about the blue liners, how many near elite players do you have on defense, and how big is the drop off before that next group of players comes in?
Well, I don't have anybody that I would say is a number one defenseman in terms of, like, I have a range of probability, and everybody has a like the ones that are in the top 15, top 20 will have some level of probability to play as a number one, but it's really, really small. So I have a couple defensemen that I would deem number two defensemen, and then the rest are all number threes. And I wouldn't draft a defenseman if you're not a number 3 or higher. I'm not drafting you in the first round. If that's where I think during your peak years, the majority of your playing is going to be as a number 3, a number 4, you're in the second round or later. And that's just like, that's how I have to range that out, because you're leaving value on the table if you're not doing that. So I think the Winnipeg Jets are in a really good position to find whether they want a forward or a defenseman at that 14th spot. I have a suspicion, just based on some past history, and then what their needs are, and then what's available in that range, that a defenseman could be the choice for them. Because yes, they have a bunch of guys under contract, but by the time those contracts start to end, they're going to need a couple more bodies coming up to replace those players.
Well, and it's interesting, Shane, that you say that, because when you look at the funnel of talent with the Manitoba Moose and the organization right now, like last couple of years, the biggest concern was on the blue line. And, the Jets added $10 million in salary last year. And it got to the point where you have a very veteran defense core on a team that disappointed, really sort of blocking a lot of young players like Avili Heinola, Dylan Sandberg. We saw Johnny Kovacevic, Declan Chisholm play. Leon Gavanka starred last night for the Winnipeg Jets, for the Manitoba Moose, I should say. But again, projecting 3-4 years down the road, these guys are either in the National Hockey League, they're elsewhere, you're basically on a whole nother cycle of that. And, with Cole Perfetti and Chaz Lucius picked as first round the last couple of years, they will have some forwards that'll be knocking on the door in the next couple of seasons. But you're exactly right. I mean, for the Jets, and I guess this speaks to picking at 14, and we've seen this before with Winnipeg. It really is a matter of playing the board and seeing what falls to you, because in this area where the Winnipeg Jets are picking, we've seen Perfetti come at 10. We've seen Josh Morrissey at 13 before, Kyle Connor at 17. The Jets do have a pretty good track record of reading the room, playing the board, and making a good selection that's turned into a quality NHL player.
Sure, there only needs to be one or maybe two greater fools who take a player above, say, what the collective group thinks. And I don't like consensus, because I think you really have to follow what your data tells you and what information you've collected. But it's right. Like in that 14 hole, there's some players in that area. So if you look at sort of like Kevin Korchinski and you look at Owen Pickering, I mean, there's a couple defensemen right off the hop out of the Western Hockey League that could be the style of defenseman that the Winnipeg Jets like. And there's many attributes about those players that are very, very good. And then there's some opportunities there to find like a really strong defenseman that could play in the number 3 hole. And that's where I have Korchinski and as well as Pickering in that for the majority of their career. That doesn't mean they couldn't bump into a number 2 role for a couple of years, but I think the majority of their years, that's where I would project them to be.
We spent a lot of time talking about and watching the Winnipeg Ice this year for obvious reasons. They're in the middle of a series with the Moose Jaw Warriors, and a young Manitoban, Denton Mateychuk, blue liner, projects to potentially be a first rounder. How much have you seen of him, and where does he project into a potential selection for July 7th?
Well, I think he's in that range too. And one of the reasons why is offensive defensemen are rare. It's scarcity. So you look at how many offensive defensemen are in the NHL. There might be 25 legitimate offensive defensemen. So when one becomes available to you that you can take in the draft, you have to seriously consider that because of scarcity and then their overall value in the marketplace, because everybody's on the hunt for them. So when one becomes available in free agency or trade, you're paying an arm and a leg to get them. So that's something else to seriously consider as well. So if he's there, or all three of those defensemen are there, I'd like to be a fly on the wall or sit right beside Chevy and Zinger and find out what are they thinking in terms of, they've already prepared their list, but sometimes players fall and then they have to have a conversation, or they just run up to the stage and take it. Just what they did with Perfetti. Oh, you're going to give us Perfetti? Thank you. Run up there and take him and get out of there as soon as possible.
And move on to figuring out what you do for the second round. Shane Malloy is with us from Hockey Prospect Radio and Sirius XM NHL Radio. Before we go, Shane, let me ask you, every scout has a guy or two that maybe are higher on their list than maybe some of the others. Is there Is there a darling or two of the draft that you're already championing right now, or players that we should be watching that, in your opinion, will be getting a real consistent look and maybe seeing their stock rise as people pay a bit more attention to their body of work?
One name that'll probably start to rise is Gleb Trezakov. He's a Russian player. His play over the last 2 months has been exceptional. And look, development is a curve, and it comes and it comes. And sometimes after Christmas, these prospects start coming down, down the railway super fast and hard charging. He's one player. So keep an eye on, see where Gleb goes in the first round. If he doesn't go in the first round, I would be like fighting in the pit to try to get a second round pick to go get him, because he could be a very valuable player. You talked about Kaprizov. He might be this draft's Kaprizov.
Shane Malloy's with us, Hockey Prospect Radio. Shane, fill people in on the show. I'm sure this is probably the best time of the year to be tuning in as we get closer to the draft. When can people hear you guys, and what do you have cooking coming up in the coming weeks?
So we're on Channel 91 on SiriusXM NHL Network Radio, Saturday mornings from 7 to 9 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then 8 to 10 a.m. on Sundays. We're going to do 8 hours of draft preview. So we're going to do 2 hours, 4 weeks in a row leading up to the draft. So we just have so much content, we couldn't get away with doing a smaller show. So, we're draft geeks, so we love doing it. If we could do 20 hours, we would, but the producers and Peter won't let us.
Hey, listen, I'm here for all of it, and I'm sure our listeners are as well. Thanks for doing this, my friend. Be well, and hopefully we can catch up in the weeks to come before we gather in Montreal. And here's Shane Wright go off the board at number 1 for the Habs.
Sounds great. Have a fantastic day.
Appreciate you. There is Shane Malloy. Check it out, Hockey Prospect Radio, weekend mornings on SiriusXM NHL Radio.